please put your hands together and welcome our panel.
Good morning, everyone. As Michael said, my name's Doron Ben-Meir. I'm the Vice President for Enterprise at the University of Melbourne. I'll come back to that. Interesting that we had little word games before. I had no idea you were going to do that, but I had prepared my own little word games, so perhaps we'll begin very quickly. And so for those that hate audience participation, I'm sorry. The first question I have is the word innovation that's in the title of the conference, creative innovation. I'd just like a show of hands. When someone says the word innovation to you, who straight away thinks of startups? When you hear innovation, do you think startups? No? No one thinks of startups. Peter thinks of startups. No one else thinks of startups? Okay. So today's session is about innovating at scale. And startups can be a very important part of that, but large organisations can innovate as well. But before we get into the depths of it, I wanted to deal with the word innovation a little bit more creatively and define it. Because we talk about it a lot, but do we ever really define it? Sometimes you can define something positively in terms of what it is, and other times you can define something more effectively by understanding what it isn't. So what would happy be without sad, for example? So the typical definition I've often given for innovation is invention plus adoption. You do something better, someone else uses it, it's innovative, etc. It's doing things better. But I'm going to pose to you a very simple question. If we're doing a happy, sad, cold, hot type relativity, what's the opposite of innovation? One word answers from anyone. Just shout it out. There is no stagnation. Another one. Operation. Was that? Operation. That's an interesting one. Okay, we've got stagnation, we've got operation. Any other words? Obsolescence. Wow, that's a good one. I haven't heard that one before. There is no right answer, right? But I'm really interested in what you think. The opposite of innovation. Convention. Any others? Just quickly, not going to take much longer. Status quo. Government. We can come back to that. Anything else? Regression. Wow, these are good words. All right. Okay, I'm going to give you a word which I'd like you to think about. Satisfaction. I want you to think about a time, any time in your lives, where you are completely and utterly satisfied. Just think about it. Completely satisfied. Now I want you to think about what you are doing at that exact moment in time, when you're completely and utterly satisfied. What are you doing? Anyone want to tell me what you're doing at that point?
Nothing at all.
Nothing. Exactly. You're doing absolutely nothing. That's why I like that word as the opposite of innovation, because if you are completely satisfied, there's nothing to do. And if you're doing nothing, you're definitely not innovating. And what we're going to be talking about today is, in the context of larger organisations or at scale innovation, what does it mean? Nothing versus something, nothing versus innovation, satisfaction versus dissatisfaction. As human beings, we in fact live in a perpetual state of dissatisfaction, interrupted by rare moments of satisfaction. But generally speaking, we're dissatisfied. The question is, what do we do about it? So in my university, Melbourne University, it's the #1 ranked university in the country. It's a very big institution. We've got 10,000 people, 65,000 students. How does a university innovate? What are we dissatisfied about? What we want to do is we want to do the best research and teaching we can do. Why would we be dissatisfied with the way things are at the moment? Well, it's really interesting. When you really get into the university fabric, there's heaps of opportunity to do what we do better. But what does that mean? Currently, for our research, for example, the tradition for many, many decades has been that our academics apply for grants from the government. They win those grants, they're very happy, they take that money, they do their research, they publish their results. It's a very well-trodden paradigm. But does that get us the best research we can do? What other inputs might we want to improve our research, improve what it is we do in terms of the ability to make society a better place, which is what a lot of our academics have as their mission. It's why they're academics in the first place. And the thing is that there's a whole world out there that our academics might not be tapping into as regularly as they would like, and that's the world of business. Globally, businesses do an enormous amount of R&D. There's a lot of insight out there. There's a lot of real deep understanding on different issues. Do we, as an academic community, get access to all of that insight, all of that understanding, all of that activity? One division of Apple does $6 billion a year in R&D. That's 6 times what the University of Melbourne spends on research. And that's just one division of one company. Is there nothing we can learn from Apple? There's only one problem. If we go and ask Apple to tell us all their insights, all their secrets, they'll politely tell us to go away. They have no interest in telling us what they're doing. There's only one reason they would tell us what they're doing, and that is if we're doing something for them as well. So we need to build relationships. We need to build relationships with those sorts of companies so we as a research institution can understand some of the breakthroughs they're making, some of the insight they have, and use that as inspiration for what we might research, for the research we might pursue. That will enrich our discovery environment. That is our mission from an enterprise point of view, to enrich our discovery and our teaching environment. They could help us with teaching. Imagine if you as a student had an opportunity to do some vacation work at Apple, in a particular division of Apple, or any other company for that matter. It enriches your studies. It gives you a perspective. It gives you access to what the real world looks like in certain paradigms. It's part of your education. We need to do more of that. So there's lots of ways we can broaden what we do as a university, but it requires developing relationships with companies historically we don't really have deep relationships with. So my job at the University of Melbourne is to build the facilitating infrastructure that helps our academics develop those relationships, build the quid pro quo between us as an institution and the business world in general, so that we can enrich our discovery and our teaching environment for the benefit of our students, for the benefit of our research, and ultimately for the benefit of society, so that what we do, the way we communicate that, is fully informed, fully accessing all the resources of the entire world, not just the academic world. That requires change. That requires new modalities within our institution that help us build those relationships and sustain those relationships. That's a very useful form of innovation within a large organisation. So when we're thinking about innovating at scale, when we're thinking about the different domains that our panellists will be discussing, think about that word satisfaction. Think about the dissatisfied nature that we might have in those different paradigms, and think about the sort of questions you might want to ask our panel after they've made their introductory remarks, and how you might relate to a particular form of dissatisfaction that you want to explore as we have this discussion this morning. So with that brief introduction, I will just hand over now to Paul Cobban, who will kick off the panel, the initial remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. Okay, how are you feeling? Good, good. I must say, yesterday was just amazing. Yeah, it was absolutely an amazing day, and we were discussing some really quite big and weighty ideas. And I don't know about you, but I kind of sat and reflected on the day. I thought, yeah, these are big and weighty ideas, but what am I going to do about it when I get back to the working environment? And I just wanted to share with you in the next 15 minutes or so, some of the things we've been doing at DBS to kind of address some of the issues we talked about yesterday. And for those of you who are not familiar with DBS, DBS is a Singapore headquartered bank, a small bank. We're 26,000 employees. We're only in 6 markets, all in Asia. But we've just been growing a little bit of a reputation of putting a dent in this thing called digital transformation. I just want to share a little bit about our story. Before I start, I'm very conscious that I'm going to be talking a little bit about culture to you. And I am an employee of a bank. and I come into Australia in the era of the Royal Commission, so I'm very conscious of that, but I trust you guys to give me the benefit of the doubt in that, so thank you. Okay, so let's get going. True story. I joined DBS almost to the day 10 years ago, and on my very first day, I got into a taxi and I said, "Can you take me to DBS, please?" And the taxi driver said, "Yeah, sure, DBS, damn bloody slow." Because at that time, DBS had this reputation for certainly having lack of satisfaction with our customers. This was our customer sat scores at the time, and by the way, that's our logo right at the bottom, and we have been there for some time. And the reason for that, or part of the reason for it, is our heritage. Actually, DBS was set up about 50 years ago to help Singapore develop when it got its independence. And D in DBS actually stands for development, so the Development Bank of Singapore. And that was our reputation. That's what I walked into on that first day. It was quite ironic because I was there to kind of drive this transformation. 7 years later, though, we won Best Digital Bank in the World from Euromoney. And last year, we won 11 distinct global awards, including Best Bank in the World by Global Finance. And this is quite something for a little tiny bank like ours to win these big awards that no bank of our size has won before at this scale. It's a big deal. It's like some tiny independent movie winning a bunch of Oscars. That's what it feels like. And we were actually quite surprised to win these awards. Delighted, but surprised. I showed my son, my 17-year-old son, by the way, this slide, and he goes, "Dad, you do know what hashtag BBIW stands for?" I said, "Yes, best bank in the world." He goes, "Nah, biggest bullshit in the world, Dad. Stop trying to be cool." Anyway, so how did we do it? How did we go from being damn bloody slow to getting these accolades? Well, actually, what we've done is we've been through a series of different transformations, and each one has built on the success of the previous one. And we haven't stopped doing any of them. We continue to grow and evolve those transformations. And the idea is we continue to build capability in our people, but more importantly, we create confidence in our people, the confidence to innovate and transform. And I just want to dive into a couple of these very quickly, just to give you a flavor of what I mean. I'm going to start with customer experience, bearing in mind we were damn bloody slow where we were. And the first thing we did when I walked in is we created a program of process improvement event, or PIEs. And these were just 5-day workshops, cross-functional team, in a room, walk a process, look for ideas about a change, implement the change all in 1 week. Very successful. We ran 50 in the first year, and we took 250 million customer waiting hours out of the system on an annual basis. If you go back in time 250 million hours, you end up in the Stone Age. It's a lot of time, and customers notice a difference. And essentially what it did, it gave our people confidence. They were empowered to make change very quickly, and it unleashed the energy of the company. And it was kind of a bit of a serendipitous surprise for us. We hadn't realized, we didn't set out to do it, but this is what happened. And in that one year after running these events, this is what happened to our customer sat scores, where we stayed ever since, which is quite amazing. And so we kind of evolved that thinking. I was very fortunate. Early on in my journey, I had somebody join my team who had a background in design thinking. And this was before design thinking was a thing. And he taught us how to do customer journeys, and think about design thinking, etc. And we've run, since then, 500 customer journey projects in the company. That has changed the culture of DBS completely. And one of the things that we do and we learned through that process was, first of all, when we teach people how to do design thinking, you have to come with a real problem to work on. This is not a theoretical exercise. Secondly, we really want to understand the customer's job to be done. What's the customer trying to do? And just to borrow a phrase from Lord Turner yesterday, is nobody wakes up in the morning and says, "Hey, today's a great new day to do some banking. Come on, everybody, let's do some banking together." Nobody's job to be done is the banking, it's something broader. And really understanding that is fundamentally important, and not just at the functional level, the emotional and social level as well. And this is where we realize that if we want to be successful and take the friction out of banking, we want our bank to disappear. We want to make it become invisible. And that's our vision at DBS, is to make banking invisible. And then as we evolve into our digital world, we wanted to apply that journey thinking into our digital journeys. And digital journeys have an added advantage in that you can instrument them. And you can use analytics. And we are developing this thing called customer science, which is able to use predictive analytics to prevent problems before they happen. And we have a target, which we're well on the way of meeting, is to prevent 1 million problems of our customers before they actually happen. And to do that, as I say, we instrument each of our digital journeys through our apps and our website so we can understand what's going on. We can see where there's design issues, etc., and as well predict. And we can do things like this. And we can visualize the movement of the customers as they navigate, in this case, a mobile app. And the way to read this is on the left is a pre-login experience. And you can see each ball represents a customer moving around the different functionality. And then on the right-hand side, it's after login, and you can see people navigating around that. And the different colors represent different segments of customers, and the yellow ones are indeed our wealth customers. So we can really see what's going on, and we've got a monitoring center. We take this very seriously, where we have all these visualizations going on so we can see what's happening to our world to make sure we give our customers the best possible experience. And so on this success we had with customer experience, we wanted to build on. This is where we started thinking about innovation. And we had a couple of false starts with innovation. We did the thing, we got a couple of talented people and stuck them in a room with some beanbags and says, don't come out until you've invented time travel or something. And of course they didn't do that. And then we hired a really smart change agent and see what he could do, and that failed too. But then we ended up landing on a model that's worked well for us. And I have a small team. This is my innovation team. Smart bunch of people, very few bankers. They're a completely eclectic bunch. The guy in the striped shirt sitting down there, his name's Bidget. He's an ex-Bollywood guy. He actually worked in Bollywood. Now he's running our innovation team, and a whole bunch of different characters in there. And we empower them completely. We empower them to do whatever they want, but we give them one rule, and one rule only. And the rule is that under no circumstances are they allowed to innovate. And why is that? Why would we say that? And the reason is because we want them to teach the rest of the company how to innovate. And so how do we do that? We do that through a number of programs. We've had 50 or 60 different programs over the last few years. Here's some examples. We worked with startups. We talked about startups already. We work with startups a lot, but initially we worked with startups purely to give experience to our senior executives of what it's like to work as a startup, that feeling of agility. We didn't even work with fintechs. There was one startup we worked with that was selling bamboo bikes. Another startup that was trying to figure out how to use ugly fruit that supermarkets kind of rejected. But we've evolved that model, like all of them, now that we are very specific with this startup exchange program, where what we do now is we look for business problems, and then the innovation team will scan the startup universe and say, is anybody working in this area? We'll do a beauty parade, and then we'll fuse together the startup and the business, and then they'll work together on creating a solution, which has been very successful. Even hiring. We reinvented our internship program, so no more making the coffee and doing the photocopying. You get selected through a hackathon process, and you go through an 8-week program of innovation. And this has become a very rich source of talent for us. And we've extended this now that we actually hire most of our IT and tech people through hack-to-hire programs, and we get the really high quality and very, very effective selection process by doing this stuff. But this is underpinned by a really significant learning process. That we have this belief, and we talked about a bank yesterday here in Australia who are laying off people. We are not laying off anybody. We believe that everybody in our company has the ability to transform. And I was inspired when I visited Netflix, and there was a guy called Agent Cockcroft who told me a story about another banker who had gone to visit them recently. And the banker had said, you guys at Netflix, you have these amazing young engineers, and Adrian goes, 2 things. One is the average age of an IT engineer at Netflix is 40. And secondly, who do you think I hired them from? I hired them from you, and I just got out of their way. And this gave me the inspiration to feel that you can teach old dogs new tricks, and this is what we believe. And each one of these things in this honeycomb is a learning experiment that we've tried because we recognize everybody learns in different ways, and some of these work better than others. But we've had great success in transforming our people into become digital savvy. And this is underpinned in itself by a more formal program called Digify. And the question was asked yesterday, what are digital skills? And here's our definition of the digital skills. And we have a massive program where we expect everybody in the company to participate up to 3 levels of expertise in these areas. And so based on this, we realized that we're onto something. We're having a lot of success in these programs, the other ones I haven't got time to talk about. And then we asked ourselves the other question about culture. They said that culture is the single most important thing that will make all these successes we've had sustain. But how do you design a culture? How do you move to a different culture? Can we use some of the techniques we've been using to shift our culture? And so, it's a lovely animation. We worked hours on that. And this idea that can we kind of define a future state very carefully, identify blockers, and then run experiments to see if we can overcome those blockers. And first step was, how we defined our future state as we want to become a 26,000 person startup. And these are the characteristics that we decided we want to emulate in a startup. And each of these has much more specifics around it. So we can try and give people a very precise vision about where we want to head. Very important step. I mentioned on day one, actually, that I find a lot of companies can't articulate where they want to go. And then we start thinking about the blockers, and we use a lot of data and ethnographic research to do that. And then we come up with some experiments about what we want to do to try and overcome those blockers. And we plot them on this culture radar. And the idea is the outer circles are experiments within a team, and if they're successful, they head towards the beginning of the middle of the circle, and in the middle of the circle, they're bank wide. And the most famous of these is this thing called Meeting Mojo. And to my amazement, I'll tell you a little bit about Meeting Mojo in a minute, but it's featured in Harvard Business Review Idea Lab, and last week, MIT Sloan Management Review also featured this ritual. And it's been copied by a number of companies, and we have these artifacts around the place that our visitors steal. And it amazes me, it's just a very simple thing. And its genesis was that I ran a Culture by Design session with our top 250 leaders 3 years ago, and I asked them the question, what's the biggest thing that's getting in the way of our culture of innovation? And they said, and to my almost embarrassment, the number one thing they said was our meeting culture. Our meetings, there's too many people, there's too many of them, they're ineffective, et cetera, et cetera. We need to figure it. So we came up with this ritual called Meeting Mojo, and it's very simple. So Mo is the meeting owner, and every meeting in DBS, you have to have a meeting owner. And the meeting owner has to do three things. Firstly, state the purpose of the meeting up front, and then at the end of the meeting, summarize the meeting. But most importantly is during the meeting owner has to make sure there's equal share of voice. So Jeff from Nesta yesterday talked about collective intelligence, and he just touched on meetings. And this is our attempt to try and have all the collective intelligence of the meeting actually contribute. We have doubled the effect. Sorry, there's one more very important part of Meeting Mojo, and that's Joe. So one of our visions is to make banking joyful. Don't laugh. And so Joe stands for Joyful Observer. And Mo points to Joe at the beginning of the meeting. At the end of the meeting, Joe spends 30 seconds just saying how well Mo did the job. And that has just yielded unexpected results. First of all, it gives people to practice in giving feedback in safe environments. And the meetings that in DBS have doubled in their effectiveness since we've rolled this out. And we've done lots and lots of these different experiments. Most of them fail. Most of them fail. But the ones that have been successful have really moved us forward to our future culture. We're not there by any means yet. We've still got an awful lot of work to do. But it's given me the confidence that we actually can create a culture by design and to realize our ambition to make banking joyful and invisible. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I usually do an icebreaker that goes along the lines of, hi, I'm Jane King, I'm from the Tax Office, and I'm here to help you. That usually does it. So, look, rather than talk about what government's been doing, I thought it'd be more useful in a short space of time to talk to you about what we're thinking in terms of the future. So this is a piece of work that has been commissioned to review what the public service of 2030 should start thinking about and start preparing for. And this in particular is a piece of work that's come from BCG, and they have looked at about 100 megatrends and put together some scenario thinking. So these are the 4 scenarios that they've come up with. Techsplosion, so basically a turbocharged take-up and acceleration of all of the technologies that we've been talking about over the last few days, which means that government itself has taken up data analytics, data analysis, AI, and that's become central to our policy. And what it means, or could mean, is that job decline is happening far more quickly. Are we transitioning and reskilling quickly enough? And of course, we're having a lot of discussions with unions, as you might imagine at this point in time. The second one, which hopefully will move any minute. Devolution revolution. So this is about a lack of faith in big institutions, moving down to a local level, really mistrusting the large institutions. Obviously that's already commenced, but it's even more so happening in this particular scenario. And consequently, federal government is starting to push down a lot of the policy making and delivery down to a state and local level. Who knows, maybe we'll get down to 2 levels of government, which would be even more interesting outcome going forward. But it's very much about place-based in a local context, and all of the funding becomes outcomes-based rather than agencies-based. The next one is WikiGov. Again, the public's trust in institutions has rapidly declined. And what we're also seeing is we're struggling to make a lot of progress on many of the big issues. So we are at this point, and we will continue to do so. Policies around climate, trade, immigration, all of those sorts of things become very difficult. A lot of folk are being caught up in echo chambers. And so how do we get to a position where we can be open, transparent, have those sensible discussions, have a participatory democracy, but making sure we're all in the same place in terms of our ability to participate in that policy development going forward. And last but not least, the New World disorder. And this essentially, you would recognise elements of it already, accelerated instability on political, economic and environmental environments. Tensions very high. International agreements are falling over. And essentially we're drawing up the drawbridge and we're expecting our government and trusting our government will protect us, so becoming very insular, inward looking, etc. Now the reality is that we're probably somewhere in between those as we land to 2030, and one of the things that we have looked at are what are the things, regardless of the outcome, that will help us in terms of success factors going forward. So one of them is aligning our resources, not doing it agency by agency. We need to stick together to make this work. The second is making sure whatever services and policies we're developing, it's at a local level. So it's my service, my way, and government understand what's coming. Third one, extensive use of data and analytics, not just for the delivery side, but we can become disruptors as well. We can see a lot. So we hopefully can come in on bad behaviour, for instance, very quickly with the use of analytics and pattern work that we're doing now. So we will be disruptors as well. Capacity to ensure that we've got the broad spectrum of skills covered in every way, and more pressure to perform against that broad band of skilling, not just the more traditional skills you might see in government. Ability to get it together. Act as one, be a whole of government transformation capability. Not an easy task. It's often hard just to get all together in one agency if you're a very big agency. But more and more of what we're doing has to be delivered in a whole of government context. And last but not least, it is that participatory democracy. So how do we ensure that we're working with and through citizens and businesses to actually deliver on the collective future that we want? So it's very much no longer about business as usual. It's got to be about change as usual, but it's got to be together. I don't think we're at that point where we can keep saying government should do, everybody should do, but how do we do it together is the question. Thank you.
We're all experiencing the huge confrontational components which follow from the pervasive philosophy of contemporary change. These elements arise from thoroughly altered behaviours and expectations, as importantly, which follow from the application of digital technologies. Those forceful changes require adaptive ingenuity in large organisations and government, with the need to change organisational cultures ground up if we're to achieve workable outcomes in the world generally. I mean, we've seen that evidenced by both the ATO and DBS. People often say the world is changing. I think that misses the point entirely. The world is not changing, it has changed forever. We've witnessed the largest power transfer in human history. I refer to the unprecedented transfer of power from producers to consumers, or as I prefer to say, citizens. The significance of this shift is difficult to exaggerate, impossible to stop. Everything is impacted, from government to business, entertainment to defence, healthcare to agriculture, let alone telecommunications and too many other domains to detail. Those who enter this new environment openly, with a determination to adjust and adapt, can prosper. The others will inevitably fail. The benefits of incumbency in business are rapidly eroding. The challenge for government is immense. There's a need to ensure a refashioned work and thought ecosystem, one which comprehends societal empowerment through ubiquitous connectivity, which has changed the way the world thinks and behaves. The right cultural settings are central, ones which drive innovation, drawing from its central life force, developing mindsets, processes and behaviours fit for purpose in a quite bewildering time. Meeting such potent forces which demand reconfiguration is not easy. Relevant responses are essential to driving sustainable futures. The effect on politics, direction of governments and law is presently quite unclear. We see turbulence as never before, reflected in wholly different commercial and social operating models and in people's behavioural responses. The game has changed. In today's world, disintermediation is the name of the game. Disintermediation is a long word with a very simple meaning. It means the reduction in the use of intermediaries in transactions between producers and users. It is central to innovation and disruption in a digital environment. Technology and fresh thinking is driving disintermediation in all things. The possibilities are endless. For example, in the broadcasting and telecommunications domain, disintermediation lives with a capital D, whilst we still have settings which should only apply to old world extant broadcast and telecommunications oligopolies with a capital O. The world has moved beyond that mindset. Technology, new entrants and behaviours are disintermediating existing players and their regulators, who are now out of the loop entirely, with legacy rules and views that don't pertain to those new entrants. Innovation is something we talk a lot about in Australia, and we spend billions on R&D. However, managed programs of innovation in Australia have an uneven history and effectiveness. It's often process obsessive, but outcome poor. Regrettably, it's a regular pattern of modern Australian experience seen in outmoded policy approaches. For example, a second entirely automated economy has now emerged where machine-to-machine conversations are standard. It already powers the physical economy. It's contributed massively to productivity growth since the 1990s. It will go further and has probably overtaken the size of the physical economy already. It provides a deep, qualitative, unregulated change, introducing intelligent, automatic responses to the daily operation of society. As AI becomes ever more prevalent, the implications for society in work, planning and regulation have not been resolved, although they demand resolution, I suggest, in different, entirely fresh ways. Because new rules are now being written by digital technology, reflecting dramatic challenges for society in planning and regulation, labour, investment, recreation, retirement, healthcare, communication and more. In parallel with the impact of technology are three other equally remarkable forces at work: ever-increasing urbanisation, the challenge of ageing, and the changed landscape from globalisation in the movement of people, finance, trade, and data on an unparalleled scale. Clearly, legislative action and regulation is currently disconnected from these realities. A logic reset for the digital era is required. This seems to me to represent the heartland of the reinvention challenge. Governments are, on all available evidence, processing innovation at scale poorly. Large organisations are having mixed results but understand the imperatives in a better way. DBS is an outstanding example of a large enterprise that is actually reinventing itself completely, and it sounds as if it's very effective. Democracy has a ferocious challenge to adapt and adjust in its parliaments, courts, regulators, and other institutions and political frameworks. Does it all reflect a strange amalgam between the writings of J.G. Ballard, Philip K. Dick, Aldous Huxley, Ursula Le Guin, and George Orwell? Is it dystopian, or will it offer new horizons of wonder, optimism, and social improvement? Truthfully, the answers are probably yes and no in equal parts. We're experiencing a fascinating, albeit compulsory ride, one which will have increasing speed with the necessity of adoption and adaptation to the digital disruption settings at the core. When you stand back and think about it, does anyone here really think that existing regulatory models are relevant or sustainable in such a rapid-fire world? Look at the inability of government to meaningfully respond to the disruptive force of social media as but one of many checkpoints. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to all the panellists. That was a very good introduction to what we can discuss. You can see we've got a lot of ground we can cover here. Start thinking about the sort of questions you'd like to put to the panellists. I'm going to begin with just a couple of questions to get things going, but if you do have questions, put your hands up. We'll start gathering behind perhaps the microphones so that you have an opportunity to be heard by everyone when you ask your question. But just to begin, Paul, if I could start with you. You've described a large organisation that is, in a sense, trying to reinvent itself. And it would appear with some real success. But what are the underlying challenges that you're grappling with still? And how do they manifest in the paradigm of the smaller companies cherry-picking, in a sense, elements of your business? And how do you see that playing out over time? From the larger company's perspective? Do you see it as you have the opportunity to maintain your scale, grow your scale? Do you think there is a place for the smaller players, or will there ultimately be an aggregation and a re-establishment of a new normal, but a normal that has scale players as the dominating parties?
Okay, so I'll address your question in the finance sector because that's what I feel I know most about. A couple of trends, that what we've seen, as I mentioned, we've been working with startups extensively for 5 to 7 years. And 5 years ago, you speak to the fintech guys and their language was very aggressive. He said, we're going to eat bankers' lunch. That's what it was. We're going to kill the banks. And there's still some of those startups around. And some of them have been very successful in nibbling away at our margins, and we recognise that, and it's definitely happening, and it worries us. But we are seeing a different trend. An emerging trend is that startups want to work with banks because they, realise that getting into banking in particular is tough. The regulators are our best friend, because they're keeping the startups at bay. That's the only thing that's prevented the finance industry being completely disrupted already. And so we're finding increasingly that we're working with startups. And as I mentioned, and what's happening is that we are seeing that we are partnering with other companies as well, not even startups, to solve end-to-end customer problems. So as I mentioned, you look at the job to be done paradigm, and you're wanting to kind of solve, somebody who wants to buy a home. And so merging all the partners together in that process to taking the friction out, rather than an individual having to navigate all these different players, you then string together the ecosystem. And so what I think is going to happen is that the winners in this are going to be the businesses, and there may be banks, there may not be banks, who can orchestrate the ecosystems. If you're going to be a participant in an ecosystem, they're going to be very commoditized very quickly. And you're going to see margins compress. And for bankers, that's going to be painful. Bankers aren't used to low margins. They like their fancy corner offices and their corporate jets, and that's going to disappear. So I think it's going to be a very painful process for the majority of players. And come back to your first part of the question, which is what are we still grappling with? And I still worry that we are, we have a reputation for doing some great work in transformation, but I don't think it's fast enough. I still worry that there's still complacency in areas of the organisation, and it's just, it's coming, and I still think we've got work to do and be more nimble.
Kim or Jane, you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I'd probably say in response to what Paul said, with some significant exceptions, I think most major banks in most jurisdictions who are not innovative in the way that DBS is, are doomed. Because there's a bunch of money here, huge quantities of capital, there's a bunch of need here with voracious needs for money, and there's a whole lot of technology in between. And when you look at banks and what they do and how they do it, it seems to me that disintermediation is almost guaranteed. Yep. And in many instances, the capital will be in another jurisdiction, the need will be in this other jurisdiction over here, and the capacity of governments to effectively keep up and regulate between the two is going to become increasingly reduced.
Absolutely right. Absolutely.
And the fantasy that this will all be done through some global construction will remain a fantasy, probably best in a 10-year-old's book.
I think you hit the nail on the head. It's the speed at which, can government predict and keep up with and be able to shape the sorts of policies that and regulation, if indeed regulation is the answer, because it's always government should regulate, government should stay out. I think it's going to be a really interesting pathway forward as to exactly what do the community and businesses actually expect from government at that point.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point because, the Singapore government's looking very closely at what's happening in Europe. The Europeans are very aggressively trying to open up banking and embrace all this new technology. But the regulator in Singapore is worried, to your point. They're saying, well, if that happens, how are we going to, the job of the regulators is to guarantee the economic stability of the country, and they're going to lose control if they open up too quickly. So they're thinking about at what pace that they're allowing that to happen. So it's a real interesting balancing act.
We have someone wanting to ask a question. Would you like to ask a question?
Yes. So we're in a world that sort of is dominated by the why. We hear about people start with why, purpose and passion. Firstly, I think Paul's presentation is the best presentation on how I have ever seen in any of these kind of conferences. So congratulations for the how. But that then leads me into a more difficult question, which I hope Paul can answer first, but everyone can talk to. The how you're saying you're going towards a cultural state, a future cultural state that is quite stable, that you have quite a strong idea about. The how is a sort of a way of hacking culture. So is that hacking going to be permanent so that your future cultural state is also going to be hacked into new forms even once you get there? And if it is, how might people learn to live in your organisation and really any organisation if that's the permanent state of future culture is an impermanent state, if that makes sense?
So those of you here on Monday, I quoted Jeff Bezos, who talks to that point exactly, and they say at Amazon they are very stubborn on their vision, but very flexible on the detail. And that's kind of the philosophy that I would like to try and embrace, that I think you've really got to have a strong purpose, and it's got to be for a higher purpose than just creating shareholder value. I think that era has gone. I think people will not work for an organisation anymore unless that's the case. So I think, to your point, if I understand the question correctly, is we do need to consider the flexibility. We need to, identify that we could be wrong in a number of areas and highly likely to be wrong in a number of areas. But the hypothesis about culture by design is it's flexible enough to navigate that if you can get it right. And it's early stages. I am not saying we've been successful. It's definitely the right way forward. But we are learning an enormous amount as we go. And we've now got a vehicle, we think, that you can actually navigate culture, which is something I hadn't really thought about before a couple of years ago. So I'm hoping we still got the flexibility to kind of adapt as the world evolves.
Yeah, I'd just like to ask you, Kim, you made comment about the disintermediation. How does the word trust fit into that equation? I think there are lots of startups cherry picking, probably wanting to work with some of the larger institutions, but if they truly disrupt them, Who do we trust?
Well, see, I actually think that the collapse of trust in many established institutions, which is, in all fairness, all their own work, has in fact facilitated disintermediation, because people increasingly do not have the same kind of sense of loyalty to major institutions when the major institutions have demonstrably failed against perfectly reasonable social licence tests, so that people are more open to alternate approaches. And it comes back to the basics. Will the transaction work? Is it reliable? Will I get the money? And all of those things that are sort of second nature to decision making will become more prominent, and the kind of halo effect of big, solid heritage is being damaged by those very institutions. Now, clearly there are some examples of institutions that are remarkably effective in constantly rebuilding themselves and reinventing themselves. I mean, Amazon's a very good example of a company that takes nothing for granted and is on a daily basis is reinventing itself, challenging itself. I think that's something which is clearly well recognised from what Jane's presentation was, but in government generally, it doesn't challenge itself in that way. I mean, it's refreshing to know that the ATO is looking at things like that, but other arms of government clearly do not measure themselves against other services and environments in which their customers interact. Because if you're not measuring yourself against Amazon, you're not measuring yourself. If you're not measuring yourself against, name effective financial institution here, you're not measuring yourself. I mean, a wait time on a phone of 38 minutes. I mean, recently a very elderly person in our family died, and we had to deal with a bunch of the stuff you have to deal with. And my wife was on the phone one day for something like 58 minutes. Now, that clearly is not connected to any kind of experiential framework that is actually part of the 21st century. It's just not acceptable.
I'd love to build on that point, if I may. I think you've hit the nail so on the head. I mean, so we have this, we like many companies, look to the tech companies for inspiration. And so we visited Google, Amazon, Netflix, Apple, LinkedIn, and Facebook. And if you take all those initials, they go Ganalf, right? And so we've got this phrase in DBS called, we want to be the D, DBS, in Gandalf, and they're the Gandalf companies. And the point is, and it's a slogan, but the point is the one you're making, is we don't compare ourselves to any banks anymore, because our customers don't. You have to compare yourselves to these thought leaders, and the response times that these guys are delivering is that's your new competition. And by setting your ambition, I mean, we're not there yet by any means, but by setting your ambition in that direction, you're more likely to succeed, I guess.
Well, look at Google. The way Google is one of the great partner organisations of the world to solve its own problems. It doesn't regard itself as having a monopoly on wisdom. It partners relentlessly and ruthlessly with any number of companies until they're no longer convenient. Microsoft is a company that has totally reinvented itself twice. I mean, back in the 90s, Bill Gates suddenly had a flashbulb moment and thought, it's the internet. He stopped all of the development inside the company and demanded, literally overnight, everything had to be focused on the internet. And of course, the browser came out of that, and they changed all of their operating systems, and they completely reinvented the company, and now have a pretty secure, dominant position in every office in the world. I mean, it's a fascinating thing. And then they reinvented themselves recently under Nadella in a way that I think is copybook digital commerce. I mean, it's not taking things for granted. It's not relying on your laurels. It's not reflecting hubris. It's saying, we've got to reinvent this company. This is a mess. And talking to people about it as openly as that.
Yes.
I mean, the thing that fascinates me in government, and I have nothing but sympathy for the public service, is that government is seemingly indifferent to these sorts of forces, and yet again it's making decisions against its own self-interest in not responding to them. It's sort of fascinating.
You're in a monopoly situation, but clearly comparing ourselves with the best of other government environments isn't necessarily the best way to go in terms of being able to improve and actually deliver on expectations. So we do the same thing. We look at, and Chris Jordan has been very clear that I don't want to compare the tax office to the tax office overseas, etc. I want to compare it to the banks, to the Googles after we finish taxing them. But it's a really important. Well, we're making good progress, in fact. So it's a very interesting partnership. But this comes back to, I think, to the culture. It's a cultural shock for a lot of public servants who often have been there for many years to hear it's not good enough to operate at the public service level. That we are a part of the broader community, we're a part of a bigger ecosystem. More and more we're actually injecting ourselves into business models, super funds, all of those sorts of funds. We have to operate at the same speed as they are. And we talk from a cultural perspective. We talk about changing, or began talking about changing, but now we talk about shifting, because you've got a culture. You don't flip it overnight, but you do need to know what is the culture you want and how do you shift toward that and remain flexible. And our people, we train to be change fit, so they're not being hit by something every 2 minutes. They know themselves how they operate in a changing environment and how they need to support themselves as well as the leaders. So it's that combination that helps us move, not at the pace we'd like to be moving at, but we're certainly moving at a lot faster than we ever have before. So.
All right, I think we've got some interesting territory there to explore in this discussion. Google, government, it's a great combination. I can see headlines already, but we have some questions I'd like to take, so over here.
So my question is primarily for Jane, but perhaps the others can talk about with regard to large businesses and the culture of the APS in general, and the alignment of agencies towards common goals is sometimes difficult when we have what I see as a leadership that possibly doesn't incentivise that amongst themselves, as leaders that push up the chain when it comes to the APS are ones that win turf wars, that get the money, that don't necessarily have to prioritise the ability to work with smaller agencies or with that friendly within their own agencies, and how that culture shift has to change with the leadership, and then to how do we make that change? Like, what actionable things can we do to get that change?
Yeah. Look, I think we're seeing more and more whole of government, but you're right, all the frameworks and systems and mechanisms don't augur well or support a whole of government approach. So we all get our individual funding buckets, we all have our own priorities. It's a federated model and for a purpose. So it's not really built to operate in that transformational way in a whole of government context. Some of the recommendations coming out of this review are now talking about head of people, head of service that would have teeth to be able to bring people to the table. I think things like outcome-based funding, more than a one-year cycle would be useful. But that sort of funding, where you have to come together, plan together, spend together, I think is a very important thing. One of the major problems is that alignment, though, of priorities. So obviously we all have our own priorities. How do we agree what the government and APS priorities are, and then move forward into that planning and funding arena? And we've had a few goes in the past, not necessarily all successful, but we do know at local, place-based, that does operate well. So that is part of the skilling, I think, and attitude, you're quite right, moving out of that territorial type thinking and being rewarded, recognised, performance managed, whatever, at that whole of deliverable rather than individual agency.
We have another question over here.
Yeah, this is a question to Jane, but it sort of leverages off some of the comments that Kim has made. In an accelerating world where the big companies are actually laying off people, or will increasingly lay off people as they get more efficient, we need to be really encouraging small and medium businesses and people to start their own businesses. But for anyone who's actually done that, you look at government regulation and it keeps changing and it keeps getting more oppressive. I'm just wondering how government can get its mind around the fact that getting rid of regulations is actually just as important as regulating.
I would not disagree. I would suggest it's also a political question in terms of the government of the day and the policies that they bring to the table as well. But you also have your business generally this problem of many businesses actually insist we should regulate. Uber. Obviously, we knew it was coming. We needed to regulate for it. It was probably too slow in the process, but you're still hearing a great outcry from the taxi industry. It just brings together the conflict, I guess, that we've got between what individuals might want versus what a community might want, and how you get the right balance in the regulation going forward.
Can I maybe just be a bit more specific? Because what you're talking about there is regulating or providing a framework for a particular industry. I'm talking about simple things like, for example, employing people and the complexity of employing people and all the regulations you've got to satisfy. And every time I have to look at a new employment contract for somebody, the laws have changed. Now, I can do that because, I've been in business a long time, but somebody who's just starting a business and is faced with actually understanding all this myriad of change and is faced with all the paperwork, it is just so debilitating, and it just sucks energy out of the system. And so much of what people have to do, when you actually look at the substantive part of it, it's so incremental in terms of supposedly improving Australia and improving people's rights. So somehow we've got to get government to step back and see the big picture of people's lives and realise that ongoing regulation of everything just saps energy out of the system. And in a world of innovation, what you don't want to do is sap energy out of the system. So somehow government's got to change. And it's like, what you were saying before about actually realising that you've got to provide the same level of service that the best people in business provide. And that means being incredibly efficient and incredibly consumer focused rather than regulatory focused. And that's a complete psychological change for government.
Yeah, look, you're right. And, from our perspective, we talk about giving good service, tax just happens is our philosophy. So that's part of our blueprint process. You don't even know it's there. It's like electricity. That's where we're trying to head to. Can we do that at a whole of government level? And there's a lot of focus on small business in particular, as you'd be aware. How do we get that together? You're seeing that more and more, but it's early days. We don't naturally operate in that way, but there's a lot. So we've just delivered on single touch payroll, hate it or love it. There's a lot of stuff in there that's going to make life a lot easier for business and for the employee going forward. But it's these pieces that we can slowly but surely bring together, and then hopefully we can do it from that consumer perspective or the business person's perspective. How do we just make it happen? Yeah, and what is it we really need versus all the stuff we might be collecting as well?
Fingers crossed.
We have another question over here.
Yeah, hello. I work at another very large institution, which is a public university, and we have touched on the importance of education over the 3 days of the conference many times. And I'm wondering, with your expertise and with your experience in innovating large institutions, if you had any recommendations how universities will need to reinvent themselves in the next few days. I think
is that all the time we have?
There's a lot happening already, and so I'm at UTS and we are out there showcasing some of the work that we're doing, but I think that's just the very tip of the iceberg, and there's much more to come. And I think all the academics would be terrified if their benchmark is YouTube, if we look at comparing ourselves to tech giants.
Well, I might take that, if that's all right, since I'm the university person here. It's an evolution, not a revolution at the university level. You can't move on a dime. These are large institutions. A lot of what they do needs to continue. It's not just a matter of the institution wanting it to continue. The issue is the sustainability of the model over time, the relevance of the value proposition that the institution offers the community over time. And that changes as the community changes, and it would be foolish for any institution, however long-lived, to assume that it has some imperviousness to the changes happening around it. So at Melbourne University, we understand those changes are happening, and we do need to adapt. And there are a number of value propositions that university delivers to society which need to be thought about. Yes, we are a teaching institution. we do more than just teaching. We need to look at all those different aspects. So on the teaching side, we are there to train professionals, yes, but we teach an awful lot more than just the professions. So we need to look at all the different modalities of teaching, be it online, micro-credentialing, all sorts of different innovations that are taking place within the educational framework we need to adapt to. That doesn't mean we throw out what we've been doing. It means we need to augment and evolve what we're doing to take advantage of those capabilities that now present to us. We can teach online very effectively. We have over 1 million online students at this point in time. They're all doing very small courses. Many of them aren't paying for them. But the point is that we need to experiment. We need to constantly challenge ourselves with what is the right combination of all these modalities to deliver the best product to our students. But we also deliver a service to the community through our research. We need to be thinking about both the nature of the research we do and also the way we communicate it. It's very, very clear to me as someone very new to the sector. I've come from a private sector background. I'm a serial entrepreneur, in fact, and a venture capitalist, so not your typical university person. But from my perspective, as someone who's spent a lifetime trying to develop value propositions from new intellectual property, universities need to think again about the way in which we communicate what we do. We do an awful lot of things that you've probably never heard about, and that's our fault. And so we need to get much better at communicating to the general public what we do, why it's useful, and demonstrate how it's useful, so that we constantly win the trust and the respect and the investment of the community in what we do. Now, these are not things that happen overnight. So if you've only given me 3 days, oof, that's tough. But they are things that we're thinking about all the time. Now, there are smaller universities probably moving faster than we are. And that's good, because in some respects, they lead the way in terms of demonstrating what can be done, and it's incumbent on us to be able to move the larger ship in that direction. But all of the work that we're doing in terms of interfacing business, and when I say business, it's not just business in a trading sense, it's all forms of potential clients of the university. So that's government as a client, it's not-for-profits, it's businesses, it's industry. All of these relationships need to be built in order to fill out our value proposition and express what we generate across the community as a whole, not just through the narrow lens of the people we teach and the degrees they may end up with. Those degrees have to become more and more relevant to the circumstances of the day, and as does our research, and as does our ability to communicate what we do. So there's a lot on our plate. We treat that exceedingly seriously, and there's an awful lot of work going on behind the scenes to try to adapt to that. But we can always do better. But your point is well made.
The interior culture of universities in our country, though, is abysmal. It is so dominated by mindless bureaucracy of an order that one would, in the exterior world, thought left Australia back in the 1980s. Certainly, government is much less bureaucratic than universities are. So that there's a serious kind of cultural dissonance between the objectives and the noble statement of purpose and the actual daily operating life of universities. And anyone who has a lot of academics in their life, you'll hear about it all the time.
Yeah.
It's a serious problem.
I would like to, I can't speak about the Australian situation, but all I can tell you is I am angry with the education system, as it stands, because what happens is when we get people coming into our organisation out of the education system, they've had their curiosity knocked out of them. And we have to spend a lot of effort unlocking the curiosity that's been knocked out of them. And all the global education systems teach convergent thinking. I'm going to pass an exam that has a series of questions from a finite body of work. We want people who can ask questions, not answer them. We want people who can just be curious and have the motivation to teach themselves and learn. And that's going to be the skills increasingly required. And I just feel, I've seen it happen to my own children. I have 2 grown-up boys, and I've seen that happen to them. I've seen their curiosity go. I've seen their self-confidence be diminished by the system. It's completely broken. And of all the industries. Banking's is not great, but the educational system, in my view, globally, is one of the most flawed there is across the world. Unless we get that right, then I'm not very particularly optimistic about the future. Sorry.
Interesting. I had a short run with universities, and my observation was they collaborate brilliantly around research. Often they don't use the research themselves, but they have no collaboration between faculties at that point. So hopefully that's improved, but I just wonder if that's not one of the problems where you're teaching down this, vertical line rather than understanding what is the flexibility we need to be able to adapt to whatever's coming.
So to use the language as we use is, I think people in education need to answer what's the job to be done? What's the functional, social and emotional job to be done, and solve for that and work backwards from that. And I don't think there's enough time spent on answering that question.
Yeah. These are good points, although we are all products of that education system, so it's not completely broken. But
challenge on that. Sorry, I've got a degree in civil engineering. I was appointed chief data officer 3 years ago, and I knew nothing about data. I'm a culture guy, right? What was my answer to that question of how do I get myself up to speed on data? I didn't go to university and take formal courses. I watched YouTube. I watched YouTube every weekend for 3 years, and now I feel like I'm a data guy. So that was my go-to way of learning, right? So I challenge that a little bit to say that we're a product of that education system.
Well, you do have a civil engineering degree, and that helped you in your own ability to learn for yourself. But I don't want to debate it. We have another question.
Yeah.
I got out of that one.
I've just got the Zeedings here, and I'm just conscious that you might not be seeing some of the Zeedings questions that are flashing up on the monitor. But
There's nothing flashing up.
Oh, okay. Well, I've got a bunch of questions here for Paul. So I'm going to actually just read some of them out, Paul, and maybe you could amalgamate some answers for them. So there could be a few. If there's too many, just stop me and we'll pause.
Okay.
But I'll just read some of them. Paul, what were the challenges or resistance to change that you faced or are facing in transformation at scale across the business, and how are you tackling that resistance? That's one. Two, how much in percentage of profits or cost per person did DBS invest in their organisational shift toward a customer-focused culture? Paul, the DBS journey, was that something that the whole organisation immediately got on board, or was it something that was implemented through a transformation centre outward?
Okay, let me stop there. The first and the third one are closely related, and this transformation is like any other. You're going to have early adopters, you're going to have resistors. What I would say is that we've had good fortune, if you want to call it that, and we've had stability of management. Just shortly after I joined, we had a new CEO who's still in place, and he very quickly put in place a very clear strategy and has stuck true to that strategy, but adapted on the way. We've raised our ambition levels along the way. And, my personal journey is very interesting, so it's an Asian company. I'm one of the few Westerners who work there, and so when I went in, the transformation guy, there's been a series of people like me in this job before, and you had the comments, oh, don't worry, he'll disappear like the other ones in a couple of years, and after 3 years, he goes, this guy seems to be staying longer than usual, and after 4 years, then kind of people, here he is again, and they'd stop saying that now, and so I think that persistency of strategy and approach is really key, but not every company gets the privilege to do that. The second question I can't answer because I don't know the answer. And the reason I don't know, and again, I'm very lucky in that I have a CEO, I don't have a P&L, I don't have any targets other than to change the culture of the company. And a lot of my KPIs are activity-based. And there's just we're taking a punt. We're taking a punt that we want to be a data-driven company. When and it's costing a lot of money to do that, but I'm not held accountable for demonstrating some financial return. And that's very liberating, because a lot of companies and previous companies I've worked for, you spend too much of your time trying to prove that what you're doing is worthwhile. And then you start twisting the truth a little bit, and you start rounding up numbers to demonstrate you deserve your bonus. And with that pressure taken away, it's very liberating.
Have one more.
Okay.
Thanks, Paul, for sharing DBS journey and insights. These are Zeeding's questions, by the way, if you're wondering where they're coming. They're not my questions, personally, but I'm very interested in them. Given all the experiments you are running, many of which don't succeed, how do you ensure your employees remain open to change and actually try each new initiative rather than thinking this is just management leadership's next flavour of the week, or get bogged down in the usual ways of working in business as usual?
Okay, it's partly the way I answered the previous question, but on experimentation, it's very interesting, right? So, you speak to Apple and Amazon and Netflix, they'll tell you on average, one idea in 20 is a good idea. Yeah, and so you should expect your idea is a bad idea. But we've all been brought up, maybe it's a result of our education system, I'm not sure, to deal with the idea that is right and proving that your idea is right. But if you go in the attitude that your idea is wrong, then you're forced to think in an experimental way. And you should be rewarded on the learning the experiment gives you rather than whether the experiment works or not. Now, you may have heard the expression hippo, the highest paid person's opinion, counts. And that was very prevalent and is still prevalent to a certain extent in the company. I heard a new one recently talking about animals. We started off with animals today. Zebra. If you're a zebra, you've got zero evidence, but really arrogant. And so we're trying to create a culture of being data-driven and forcing those kind of behaviours in the meeting. And we'll ask questions like, it's another kind of one of these rituals we're trying to introduce, is to ask the question, how do you know? So somebody comes up and says something, how do you know? And what does the data say? These are kind of just vocabularies that we're trying to introduce.
Another question over here.
Yeah, hi to the panel. So the question actually comes back to the first question around purpose. Now, I know we're talking about innovation at scale at large organizations, but the main purpose of people, are not necessary to sort of work at a large organization. So, to the other question around small business and freelancers and so forth. So I'm interested to hear from the panel, at different organisations, universities, government, and so forth, what specific tools or processes you have in place to engage with individual to tap into their potential contribution to what you're trying to do in innovation? Because, the stat says that about half of the economy is actually either freelancers or small businesses. So, the question is how do you actually tap into that?
Well, in a lot of my working roles, I've always had a whole roving, changing test group of consumers that are actually involved in going down a development pathway with you. I left Foxtel 8 years ago, but I ran it for 10 years through all of its digital development days when it was growing very, very substantially. And we tested everything with consumers, and we invited them to be as candid as possible in their feedback, and we listened very, very closely to them. And we did that online, we did that by phone, and we did it in workshop groups. And in all the biggest objection to it was to say, well, they'll all blab and they'll all talk outside. And I said, well, let's not assume that. We'll deal with that if that happens. But why don't we tell them that this is a confidential process, that they're part of our development pathway? We never had a single leak. And Twitter had come along and we never had a single leak. People respected the process. They were delighted to be involved, and it helped us enormously. I think if you don't have direct external close advisory processes, you will have trouble. People expect it though. Yeah. I mean, I remember when there was a tweet about some problem in one part of Melbourne, some network problem, and someone tweeted about it, and I suddenly had this light bulb. I thought, they regard that as having registered a complaint. No, I hadn't. I mean, I sound stupid, but it was when Twitter was very new. I thought, we're completely unprepared for dealing with this. Someone has registered a complaint in a part of Melbourne. We better fix it, but we better fix how we monitor and manage dealing with Twitter, because, and subsequently with Facebook, obviously, in an even more intensive way. People identify things to you in all manner of ways that it's your responsibility to be listening, not their responsibility to be following your chosen complaints path.
Yeah, which can be dangerous. I'm just thinking of some of the police forces now really have a problem because there's a 000 emergency call somewhere in Facebook or on Twitter. How do you find it, in the right time frame to get the right outcome? But we have very similar. We know we've got a problem well in advance of any IT alert or monitor system telling us. It's all over the social media. So that screen is just as big as all of our other monitoring screens so that we know exactly what's going on. But in terms of tapping in, I think probably we do all the traditional things. We have co-design centres, we have beta products, we have large groups who volunteer to work through those products with us and tell us if it's working or not. Single touch payroll I mentioned before. We've had lots of business groups working with us around that won't work, and our understanding of payroll, we understand tax system, but payroll system was a whole new adventure that we now know far too much about. But that engagement was absolutely critical, and the ability to shift and change things. So we co-design, human-centred design, we come out, sit, watch, observe. So it's all of that. But internally we do the same thing. So our staff are able to work on beta products with us, give us the feedback. They have internal social media platforms, and idea systems, all of those normal things. But how do we, and I particularly like the way you're progressing things through and actually landing things, because that's, back to our comment about every dollar is already accounted for because it's already allocated against something. So how do we not get 1,000 flowers blooming, but one, a year gets up? So we have to be quite deliberate about carving out some funding for the small end, so to speak, the small I part. The big I is usually taken care of, but needing to motivate, needing to keep people curious and keen and engaged is really important from our perspective.
Okay, we've got a couple more questions that want to be asked, so if we could keep our answers short because we're running out of time, but please.
Okay, thank you very much. So I want to put an asterisk here that I do work for the government before I ask this question, so it might be a career-limiting move, as my boss is in the room.
It's all right, it's on film. Yeah.
But competitive markets benefit consumers, leads to innovation, and it also wipes out organisations that don't meet customer or community expectations. So how can government truly become customer-centric, meet expectations that, all of us here in this room come to expect when we deal with our private organisations for 99% of the day, when government is not a competitive market?
Yeah, look, so from my perspective, I was the first customer service manager in the tax office. So that was a huge shift. We didn't have customers, we had taxpayers. So the whole cultural shift is the first part. And certainly the philosophy there is, albeit we don't have competition per se, if people had a choice, we should be running the place such that they would choose us. So it is that cultural philosophy. But then it's back, I think, to some of the previous discussions. It's understanding what's the problem you're trying to solve, because often we complicate it. And we have a great skill called complicating, and we tend to pile it on from our perspective on what we're looking for instead of understanding what's the problem and then working with client, business, whoever it is, to actually resolve that. And then I think and then how do you deliver? And so one of our business model principles is, if you can, it's with and through others. So which, the normal government reaction is, okay, now we'll build one of those. Well, no, who else should be doing that if that's not our core business? Let it go and work with and partner, absolutely. A lot of our communications now, we're not doing direct. We're still spending a lot of money in direct because there's an expectation you'll go online and see stuff. But most of it, we just white label and pass it out to service delivery, digital distributors, etc., and they badge it and pack it up because we know they're listening to them, not to us. We've got ATO community, which is like Whirlpool. Who would have thought? So people talking to people about tax matters. We just monitor, and if there's something wrong, we'll tap. But otherwise, it's very important they do their own thing. We don't script or write stuff internally. So what we're trying to do now is to pick up their language and use it for when people ring and get answered in 30 seconds or so. So that we are thinking that way, we're speaking their language, we're asking questions from their perspective, not from the legislative or regulatory perspective. So it's that whole immerse yourself in the community, understand it, forget what your actually natural tendency is, and work together to continue to try and deliver. But you don't have to do it all.
And just from the others that are up on there on the panel as well, what's your thoughts in response to that? Because I've spent the last decade working in customer-centric roles and innovation within government, and I've seen a massive shift. I think that government is doing it better, but the rate that we're improving at is vastly slower than what every single successful private organisation is. So when will that gap become too much and the citizens will say no?
Well, I think I've got two comments. The first is there is, of course, a competitive process in theory, and that's called politics, and the competition is in fact about the political authority, which is then meant to filter through. But of course, that we all know that doesn't happen, because it's the combat is a fist fight in between the two parties, and not actually about durable alternatives. The second thing is I have only 3 letters in response, and it's unacceptable. And the letters are NBN. The NBN is one of the most catastrophically dreadful rollouts and misexpenditures and misallocations of funds in the history of the world. And it has been created entirely from regulatory dysfunction because of the ACCC being incapable of delivering a sensible, measured approach to an access regime that was using existing infrastructure and had incentives for new infrastructure to be developed. The private sector is perfectly capable of delivering a service like the NBN, with the exception of uneconomic zones. But here we are with something that's going to end up costing 60 billion plus, and it doesn't work very well, and the whole experience of it is horrendous. In my own instance, I had something like 9 people in the house for 3 days. Now that means that my installation can never be an economic installation. I know every single metric of customer installations and general performance. That's not acceptable. That kind of underperformance, non-performance, will rebound on where it's meant to be competitive in politics. I mean, but the ballot box is a pretty blunt instrument for trying to get broadband to work properly in your street. I mean, I don't think it's a very effective complaint box.
I just make one very brief comment. Kim's highlighting an area where government is intervening in a marketplace with a product and service that is deliverable by a market. But there's a lot of what government does that is not deliverable by a market. And the basic value proposition, for example, of the tax office is, would you like to pay tax? I mean, if you can't go to the market with that proposition, it's not going to sell well. So to compare it then with a commercial operation is somewhat unfair. But so where the focus has to be is on the efficiency of the delivery of the service as best can be done. But you're right, it's not a competitive situation, and in some aspects of government, it never will be. And so that does make it harder to get those efficiencies. There's no question about that. But having spent 5 years in the government, I know there's a lot of effort there, but it is hamstrung by a lot of other checks and balances which get applied to the public service, which are an inevitable result of our need to constantly audit and maintain scrupulous integrity through the public service to a level that, frankly, the private sector would never tolerate, because you'd get beaten by someone who didn't live up to that level, those sorts of standards. So it's not an entirely fair comparison is all I'm saying in some cases, but Kim's example is a very good one. All right, I'm going to have to wind it up there. Thank you so much for participating. Please join with me in thanking our panellists.